The official inquiry into the Altamaha River deaths began on a humid Wednesday in April of 1841. Though the seal placed upon the final report suggests the authorities wished it had never started at all. Sheriff Cornelius Halloway was the first to view the corpse of Elias Thorne, a man whose influence in the timber trade was eclipsed only by the pretense of his virtue. Thorne was found tangled in the cypress roots near the Darien docks, his skin waterlogged, but the message carved into his chest still legible to the naked eye. The word was absolution, etched with a precision that implied a steady hand and a perverse sense of mercy. The discovery sent a tremor through the planter class that no earthquake could have matched, for it confirmed a pattern that the elite had desperately attempted to ignore. This was not a robbery, nor a dispute over boundaries, but a targeted execution that defied every assumption of the social order. Sheriff Halloway, a man whose career had been defined by the maintenance of order through the enforcement of human property laws, found himself outmatched by a phantom. The previous 30 months had witnessed a cascade of ruin among the district's most prominent families, a slow-motion collapse that Halloway had observed with growing impotence. He had watched the grand estates of the Vance and Gentry families crumble into bankruptcy and scandal, their patriarchs dead by their own hands, or by the murky depths of the river. Now, with Thorne's body cooling on the wooden planks of the wharf, the final chapter of this bloody saga seemed to have closed, yet the investigator felt no satisfaction. The files he compiled, thick with witness testimony and inventory lists, offered no name for the prosecution, only a void where a culprit should have been. The historian Callaway Vance, writing in the early 20th century, would later describe this period as the Silent Panic, a time when the ruling class of the Georgia coast realized their supremacy was fragile. Halloway's journals, preserved in the McIntosh County archives, reveal a man grappling with a terror he could not articulate. He noted the dates of death, the transfer of deeds, and the whispered rumors that circulated among the enslaved populations, but he could not reconcile the mechanics of the crimes with the social station of the likely perpetrator. The sheriff was chasing a shadow that moved freely through the parlors and bedrooms of the elite, turning the tools of intimacy into weapons of mass destruction. Every lead dissolved into silence, and every suspect possessed an unbreakable alibi. What terrified the community most was the surgical nature of the destruction. These were not crimes of passion, hot and messy, but calculated demolitions of character and lineage. The first death, that of Silas Gentry, had been dismissed as a tragic accident of commerce, a drowning resulting from a drunken fall. But the torture evident on the bodies that followed told a different story, one of prolonged suffering and psychological unraveling. Halloway understood that someone had not only killed these men, but had first dismantled their minds, stripping away the armor of their public personas to reveal the rot underneath. The absolution carved into Thorne was not a request, but a judgment, a final verdict, passed by a court that recognized no earthly authority. By the summer of 1841, the economic landscape of the region had been irrevocably altered. The Vance estate, once the jewel of the river district, had been auctioned off to satisfy insurmountable creditors, its name stricken from the social register. The Gentry shipping interests had dissolved, their vessels sold to northern buyers for fractions of their value. This widespread devastation pointed toward a conspiracy, perhaps a coordinated uprising. Yet Halloway knew in his gut that the architect was singular. The precision was too consistent, the psychological profile of the victims too specifically targeted. The sheriff faced the distinct, horrifying possibility that one individual, hidden in plain sight, had brought an empire to its knees. The governor of Georgia, disturbed by the inability of local law enforcement to restore calm, ordered the investigation sealed in September of that year. Officially, The deaths were attributed to a contagion of melancholy and financial misfortune, a narrative that saved face for the surviving families, but satisfied no one. Holloway was forced into early retirement, a scapegoat for a systemic failure he could not prevent. He spent his remaining years obsessed with the case, scribbling marginalia in his notebooks that traced the movements of a woman who should not have existed. He died convinced that the true history of the Altamaha Basin had been written not in deeds and wills, but in the silence between the lines. To understand the scope of this silence, one must look past the official records and into the oral histories preserved by the Gullah Geechee communities along the coast. These stories, passed down through generations, speak of a time when the masters became the prey, their secrets harvested like cotton in the fields. They tell of a woman who walked through the valley of death without fear, wielding a power that no ledger could quantify. This oral tradition provides the only reliable map of the events that transpired, guiding the modern reader through the labyrinth of lies constructed by the planter class. It is within these whispered accounts that the name of the protagonist finally emerges from the shadows. Her name was Celia, and her arrival in the district marked the beginning of the end for the old order. She did not come as a conqueror or a revolutionary in the open field, but as a piece of inventory, listed on a bill of sale like a mule or a plow. Yet, the specificity of her description in the auction documents hinted at a value that transcended manual labor. The manifest described her as a mulatto woman, approximately 23 years of age, possessing a refined demeanor and literate capability. These details, usually suppressed in such transactions to avoid frightening potential buyers, were noted with unusual care, suggesting her previous owners recognized the danger she represented. The sale took place in the late autumn of 1838, under the cover of a gray savanna sky that promised rain. The seller was an estate liquidator, acting on court orders, and the terms of the auction included a curious stipulation that the buyer must transport her at least 50 miles from the city. This clause, often used to separate troublesome slaves from their kin or past associations, should have served as a warning to any prospective owner. It was a red flag, indicating that this was not merely a transfer of property, but the offloading of a liability, a solution to a problem that the city's elite were eager to export to the rural interior. Senator Arthur Vance, a man whose confidence in his own dominion was absolute, saw no warning in the document, only an opportunity. He required a house servant of exceptional skill to manage the social calendar of his ambitious wife, and the price of $800 seemed a trifling sum for a woman who could read and write. He purchased Celia without hesitation, ignoring the whispers of the auctioneer and the distance requirement that hung over the transaction. He believed he was acquiring an asset, a tool to enhance his standing among the gentry. He did not realize that he was inviting the instrument of his own destruction into the heart of his home. The Vance family estate, known as Briarwood, sat on a bluff overlooking the Altamaha River, a monument to 3 generations of accumulated power and the ruthless extraction of wealth from the surrounding timberlands. Arthur Vance stood as the pinnacle of local society, a state senator with eyes on the governor's mansion, boasting a lineage that demanded respect and a fortune estimated at nearly $60,000. His wife, Eleanor, managed the domestic sphere with a rigid efficiency, hosting gatherings that determined the social currency of the entire district. They resided in a mansion built of brick and clapboard, surrounded by manicured gardens that masked the brutal economics enabling such luxury. To the outside observer, their existence was one of unassailable stability, a portrait of the antebellum ideal, where every person, free or enslaved, knew their ordained place within the hierarchy. The arrival of a new house servant typically warranted little attention in such a grand household. Yet the atmosphere shifted perceptibly when Celia stepped across the threshold in December of 1838. She carried herself not with the downcast eyes and shuffling gait expected of the newly purchased, but with a composed steadiness that suggested an internal discipline rare in the bond market. Eleanor Vance, a woman quick to spot flaws in those she intended to dominate, found herself curiously unable to find immediate fault. The mistress of the house noted in her personal ledger that the new acquisition seemed adequate for the duties of correspondence and reception, a grudging acknowledgement of competence that veiled a deeper, instinctive wariness. For the first several weeks, Celia performed her duties with a proficiency that bordered on the preternatural. She managed the complex flow of invitations, sorted the senator's correspondence with an astute eye for priority, and oversaw the preparation of the dining room with a silent authority that the other servants instinctively obeyed. She was present in the room, yet seemed to occupy a space just beyond the periphery of notice, a quality that made the Vance family comfortable, while simultaneously rendering them vulnerable. Arthur Vance, initially indifferent to his purchase, began to observe her work with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has secured an excellent bargain, oblivious to the true cost that would eventually be extracted from his lineage. Briarwood was not merely a residence, but a fortress of social capital, and its defenses relied heavily on the strict segregation of knowledge. The Vance family operated under the assumption that their private conversations remained private, their financial anxieties hidden behind closed mahogany doors, and their personal grievances confined to the marital bedchamber. Celia, however, moved through this fortress like a draught of cool air, slipping through the cracks in the armor of the family's collective pretension. She listened not only to the words spoken directly to her, but to the silences that hung in the air after the doors closed, the heavy pauses that signaled the true emotional weather of the household. She began to construct a mental map of the family's fractures, identifying the stress points where pressure could be applied to devastating effect. The senator's schedule during the legislative session of 1839 kept him away from Briarwood for extended periods, and upon his returns, the house often felt the strain of his exhaustion. Celia observed how he sought solitude in his study rather than the company of his wife, and how Eleanor's welcomes were punctuated by a formalism that bordered on hostility. The marriage, presented to the public as a union of equals, was in reality a long ceasefire in a war of attrition. This emotional distance created a vacuum, a loneliness in Arthur Vance that he filled with the hollow distractions of political maneuvering and the occasional bottle of imported brandy. It was a hunger he dared not name, even to himself. During the long afternoons when Eleanor Vance withdrew to her chambers to manage the household accounts, the downstairs area fell into a quiet rhythm that allowed Celia to position herself strategically. She learned the specific rhythms of the senator's moods, the way he drummed his fingers on the desk when frustrated, and the heavy sigh that preceded his retreat into himself. She was not yet seducing him. She was cataloging him, dissecting his character with the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing for an operation. The information she gathered was not of a financial nature, though she noted those details as well, but of a psychological inventory, a list of unmet needs that the senator was desperate to have fulfilled. The first significant interaction occurred in early February, when a heavy storm isolated Briarwood from the surrounding roads, trapping the family and their servants indoors for 2 days. With the household in a state of suspended animation, the rigid protocols governing interaction began to soften. Arthur Vance, restless and unable to ride out to inspect his timber tracts, found himself in the library with only Celia present to tend the fire. He addressed her directly, inquiring about her adjustment to the household, a breach of the usual custom where such personal interest was considered unnecessary. He sought not an answer, but an audience. Celia responded with a careful neutrality, her voice low and modulated, offering observations about the efficiency of the staff and the smooth running of the kitchen. She provided him with what he desired most, a report of order and competence in a world he felt was increasingly chaotic. Yet, embedded in her report was a subtle acknowledgement of his burden, a phrasing that implied she understood the weight of the responsibilities he carried. It was a simple conversational gambit, easily dismissed as the polite deference of a well-trained servant, but it planted a seed of recognition in the senator's mind. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen by another person. By the spring of 1839, Celia had established herself as the silent center of the household's operations. She anticipated Arthur's needs before he articulated them, ensuring his preferred coffee was ready at dawn and his correspondence organized by the time he broke his fast. Eleanor Vance, consumed by her own social climbing and the management of the family's public image, remained oblivious to the shifting dynamic. She viewed Celia as a valuable tool, an instrument that enhanced her own status as a manager of a refined home. She did not comprehend that the instrument was slowly learning to play the master. The letters written by Arthur Vance during this period, archived by his grandson and later analyzed by historians, reveal a subtle shift in tone. While he maintained the formal diction expected of a man in his station, there emerged a recurring motif of domestic tranquility and reliable counsel that previously had been absent from his writing. He made references to the smooth running of his private affairs, attributing it to a newfound sense of order. He did not name Celia in these letters. Mentioning a slave by name in personal correspondence was considered a breach of decorum, but the implication of her presence was clear. He was becoming comfortable, perhaps too comfortable, with the arrangement. It was in May of that year that the first true test of her influence presented itself. Arthur Vance received a letter from a political rival in Milledgeville, a scathing critique of his recent voting record that sent him into a black mood for the entirety of the afternoon. He dismissed his secretary and refused dinner, retreating to his study with a decanter of whiskey. Celia entered the room under the pretext of lighting the lamps, and instead of retreating as was proper, she paused. She did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch until the senator felt compelled to acknowledge her presence. It was a reversal of the expected power dynamic, a subtle claim to the space that signaled the beginning of the next phase. The confrontation in the study did not begin with a shout or a command, but with a question that hovered in the dim light like smoke. Arthur Vance, his cravat loosened and his eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of political warfare, stared at the woman who had interrupted his solitude. Celia stood near the bookshelves, her hands folded, projecting an image of passive servitude that perfectly masked the predator within. She spoke of the letter lying open on his desk, not its contents, but the weight of it, suggesting that the burdens of statecraft were heavy for a man to carry alone in a room with no counsel. It was a trespass against the social order, a slave offering an opinion on the master's stress, yet the senator did not dismiss her. Instead, he slumped back in his leather chair, defeated by his own need for recognition. He began to talk, hesitantly at first, testing the boundaries of this strange new confessional. He spoke of the legislature, of the unceasing demands of his constituents, and the gnawing sense that his peers respected his position but did not value his person. For years, Eleanor had been his partner in ambition, but she had long since ceased to be a partner in vulnerability, offering only cold pragmatism when he sought warmth. Celia listened without interrupting, her silence a canvas upon which Vance could project his own desires. She offered no solutions, only a profound, unnerving attention that suggested she understood the nuances of his suffering better than his own wife. This was the first harvest of the operation, the gathering of trust that would later be weaponized against him. Over the ensuing weeks, the dynamic in the household shifted with the imperceptible creep of a rising tide. Arthur Vance found reasons to be at home more frequently, inventing excuses to avoid the club in Darien or the late sessions in Milledgeville. He began to seek out Celia's proximity, not overtly, but through the architecture of his routine. He would linger in the hallway when she was directing the maids, or call for refreshments in the study during hours he knew she would be the one to bring them. The household staff, attuned to the subtle shifts in power, began to treat Celia with a deference that was markedly different from the respect due to a mere house servant. They sensed that she had become essential to the master's equilibrium. By June of 1839, the emotional infidelity was complete, though no physical line had yet been crossed. The senator's demeanor had lightened, his temper soothed by the balm of regular private conversations. Eleanor Vance noticed the change, but attributed it to the success of his recent legislative maneuvers, unaware that her husband was drawing sustenance from a source she had always considered beneath her notice. The gap between husband and wife widened, not through conflict, but through the senator's secret withdrawal. He was building a private world within the walls of his own estate, a world where he was not a politician or a patriarch, but simply a man who was heard. The physical seduction began not with passion, but with an accident of timing and a calculated maneuver. On a humid evening in late July, a thunderstorm struck the river basin with sudden violence, knocking out a window latch in the senator's private sitting room. Vance, already in his nightclothes, was attempting to secure the shutter against the wind when Celia appeared to assist him. The struggle with the wind and the rain brought them into close quarters, their hands brushing against the wet wood. In the flash of lightning, the senator saw her not as property, but as a woman, her dress damp, her eyes reflecting the storm. The barrier that society had erected between them dissolved in the chaos of the elements. He kissed her first, a clumsy, desperate act that was as much a plea for validation as it was an expression of lust. Celia did not resist, but neither did she succumb to the romance of the moment. She accepted the advance with the gravity of a transaction being finalized. They moved from the shutter to the settee, the storm masking the sounds of their transgression from the rest of the sleeping house. For Vance, it was a release of years of accumulated loneliness, a surrender to the forbidden fruit he had been conditioning himself to desire. For Celia, it was the turning of the key in the lock, the moment the trap snapped shut on the master of Briarwood. The morning after brought a flood of guilt that threatened to capsize Arthur Vance. He sat at the breakfast table, unable to meet Eleanor's gaze, his hands trembling as he lifted his coffee cup. He avoided the parts of the house where he might encounter Celia, terrified that his sin was written on his face. He considered sending her away, perhaps to a distant cousin's farm, to remove the temptation and the reminder of his failure. But the thought of her absence created a panic in his chest that felt physical, a withdrawal symptom from the substance she had been carefully administering. He was trapped between the terror of discovery and the agony of deprivation. Celia, observing his distress from a distance, knew exactly when to apply pressure. She contrived a moment in the pantry, intercepting him as he sought a brandy to steady his nerves before dinner. She did not apologize or weep, behaviors that would have forced him to confront the morality of the act. Instead, she offered reassurance, framing the event as a natural culmination of the bond they had forged. She implied that their connection was a sanctuary, a secret world where the rigid laws of Georgia held no sway. By reframing the sin as a special privilege, she disarmed his guilt and bound him tighter to her will. The affair settled into a pattern of dangerous regularity by August. They met in the storage cellar, in the summer kitchen during the afternoon rest period, and occasionally in the senator's private carriage when he traveled to inspect the outer timber tracts. Vance, once a man of rigid discipline, became sloppy in his coverings, leaving letters in his pockets and whispering endearments when he thought no one could hear. The power dynamic had inverted completely. The master now lived in fear of the servant's silence, while the servant dictated the terms of their engagement. The prison of appetite that Celia had identified was now fully constructed, and Arthur Vance was its sole occupant. The culmination of this phase was not a moment of passion, but a moment of extraction. During a tryst in the early autumn, Vance, seeking to impress his lover and reassure himself of his power, began to speak of his rivals. He vented his frustrations about Silas Gentry, a neighboring planter whose commercial success in the shipping trade had long irked the senator. He revealed details of a land deal Gentry was negotiating and the vulnerabilities in his competitor's credit lines. Celia listened, committing the intelligence to memory, realizing that the time to expand the operation had arrived. The destruction of Arthur Vance was merely the first step. The ruin of the network that sustained him was the ultimate objective. She now possessed the leverage and the knowledge to bring the walls crashing down. The intelligence Celia gathered from Senator Vance was not merely a collection of scandals, but a blueprint of the economic rivalries that defined the Altamaha River Basin. Vance harbored a particular animosity towards Silas Gentry, a self-made planter whose holdings in the shipping trade threatened the old aristocracy's grip on the region's commerce. Gentry was a man of 40 years, possessing a rugged ambition that lacked the polish of the Vance lineage, but exceeded it in liquid capital. Through pillow talk and the senator's desperate need to vent his frustrations, Celia learned that Vance had been quietly undermining Gentry's credit with northern investors, a campaign of economic sabotage that the senator concealed behind a facade of civility. This information was the chisel she would use to crack the foundation of the second family. The opportunity to infiltrate the Gentry household materialized in September of 1839, when the social season demanded a level of preparation that the Gentry estate, known as Driftwood, could not manage alone. Eleanor Vance, seeking to display her family's superior resources, offered to loan Celia to the Gentry family for a week to assist with a banquet intended to impress visiting dignitaries from Charleston. Senator Vance objected strenuously in private, his jealousy flaring at the thought of his lover serving another master. But Eleanor dismissed his concerns as irrational. She viewed the loan as a strategic deployment of property, a way to assert the Vance dominance over their upstart neighbors. For Celia, it was a promotion into the heart of the enemy's camp. Silas Gentry was a different breed of prey compared to the introspective and lonely Vance. He was a man of voracious appetites and a fragile ego, constantly seeking validation for his rapid ascent up the social ladder. His wife, Martha, was a nervous woman who compensated for her husband's rough edges with an obsession for propriety that bordered on hysteria. The Gentry marriage was a tense alliance of ambition and insecurity, creating an atmosphere of high pressure that Celia could manipulate with precision. She arrived at Driftwood with her mask of professional indifference firmly in place, assessing the lay of the land and the specific vulnerabilities of the new master. Celia quickly identified that Silas Gentry's primary weakness was his need to be seen as an intellectual equal to the planting aristocracy, despite his origins in the merchant class. He wanted to be consulted on matters of policy and philosophy, not just prices and tonnage. Celia positioned herself as an unlikely mirror for this desire. She listened to his loud proclamations about the future of the railroads with a focus that suggested deep understanding, asking questions that allowed him to lecture her on economics. She stroked his vanity with the fine-toothed comb of her attention, making him feel like a titan of industry in a way his harried wife never could. The seduction of Silas Gentry was faster and more aggressive than the slow emotional conquest of Vance. By the third day of her stay, Gentry was seeking her out in the pantries and the stables, his eyes lingering on her with an arrogance that assumed his status entitled him to her. He made no attempt to hide his interest, interpreting her subservience as submission. Celia played the role of the overwhelmed admirer, flattering his ego while carefully guiding the conversation toward the topic of his rivals. She planted seeds of doubt regarding Senator Vance, implying through half-finished sentences that the older man looked down on Gentry's commercial endeavors. The banquet at Driftwood was a success by all outward measures, but in the shadows, the trap was sprung. Gentry, emboldened by a drink and Celia's whispers, cornered her in the laundry room, demanding a physical affirmation of their connection. Celia did not refuse, allowing the encounter to happen with a detached efficiency. Immediately afterward, as Gentry basked in his perceived conquest, she began the extraction. She mentioned, with feigned reluctance, that she had overheard Senator Vance discussing Gentry's debts at the bank in Savannah. She claimed she did not understand the details, but the tone was unmistakable. The senator was plotting his ruin. The revelation ignited a fury in Gentry that overrode his caution. He demanded specifics, and Celia provided them, carefully selecting the truths she had learned from Vance's own lips. She detailed the specific rumors Vance had spread about Gentry's solvency and the secret meetings with investors. The intelligence was devastating because it was accurate, stripping away the veneer of friendship that the two families had maintained. Gentry felt the sting of betrayal from a man he had tried to emulate, and his insecurity transformed into a consuming rage. He viewed Vance not just as a rival, but as a hypocrite who smiled to his face while holding a knife to his throat. Celia returned to Briarwood in late September, carrying with her the explosive knowledge that the feud was now live. Senator Vance, desperate and possessive, interrogated her about her time at Driftwood, his jealousy making him sloppy. He demanded to know if Gentry had touched her, if he had made advances. Celia denied nothing, using his paranoia to her advantage. She confessed that Gentry had spoken ill of him, recounting the insults the man had supposedly levied against the senator's honor. She poured gasoline on the fire of Vance's insecurity, ensuring that the two men would now view each other as mortal enemies. The tension between the two households escalated rapidly throughout October. Gentry, armed with Celia's intelligence, began to make moves in the market that undercut Vance's position, while Vance doubled down on his secret sabotage. The women of the families, Eleanor and Martha, found their social interactions strained by the sudden coldness between their husbands, though they remained ignorant of the true cause. The district began to buzz with rumors of a falling out between the Vance and Gentry dynasties, a schism that threatened to reshape the political landscape of the river basin. The White families were focused on the public drama, unaware that a third party was directing the script. By November, Celia had positioned herself as the center of gravity for both men. Vance was emotionally dependent and terrified of exposure, while Gentry was inflated with a sense of righteous vengeance and the thrill of his secret affair. The triangle of mutual destruction was complete. All that was required now was a spark to ignite the powder keg. Celia did not need to do anything further to stoke the conflict. She simply needed to wait for the natural consequences of male pride and envy to take their course. She had built a machine designed to tear itself apart, and she stood ready to watch it burn. The rupture between the Vance and Gentry families transitioned from a Cold War of whispered insinuations to open hostilities in December of 1839. The flashpoint was a meeting of the Altamaha Planters Association, held in the Drafty Assembly Hall in Darien. Silas Gentry, emboldened by the intelligence Celia had fed him regarding Senator Vance's financial manipulations, stood before the gathered elite and publicly accused Vance of conspiring to devalue the region's timber notes. The accusation was a breach of the unspoken code of the aristocracy, which dictated that disputes be settled in private clubs, not public forums. The room fell into a stunned silence as Vance, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic, struggled to formulate a denial that would not expose his own underhanded dealings. The confrontation devolved into a shouting match that stripped away the veneer of gentlemanly conduct. Gentry laid bare the specifics of Vance's sabotage, citing dates and bank correspondences that could only have come from an intimate source within the Vance household. Arthur Vance, cornered and humiliated, lashed out with personal insults regarding Gentry's lineage and his wife's nerves, further deepening the rift. The spectacle fractured the district's social unity, forcing neighbors to choose sides in a conflict that seemed driven by business rivalry, but was actually orchestrated by a servant who moved invisibly between the warring camps. The feud was now a matter of public record, setting the stage for the catastrophic violence that Celia had planned. While the white patriarchs destroyed their reputations in Darien, Celia turned her attention to the third piece of the board: the Paris family. The Paris estate, known as Oakhaven, lay a few miles upriver, a sprawling property known for its rice cultivation and its stern, aging patriarch, Judge Josiah Paris. The judge was a widower, a man of rigid moral posturing, who held a seat on the circuit court. However, it was his eldest son, Julian Paris, who drew Celia's interest. Julian was 32 years old, unmarried, and possessed a secret that was an open whisper among the enslaved community, but a devastating scandal waiting to erupt in the white world. Julian Paris preferred the intimate company of men, a proclivity that was not merely a private vice in the eyes of the law, but a capital crime. He lived in constant terror that his father, a man who quoted Leviticus as readily as the Bill of Rights, would discover the truth and disown him. Celia had identified Julian's vulnerability months earlier, noting the way his gaze lingered on the stable hands and the specific visitors who called upon him late at night under the guise of intellectual discussion. She understood that Julian was a prisoner of his own identity, a weakness that could be converted into a powerful alliance. The approach was made in January of 1840, not through seduction, but through a calculated demonstration of power. Celia intercepted Julian near the Mercantile in Darien, arranging an accidental collision that allowed her to pass him a folded note. The message was succinct, promising absolute silence regarding his private walks in exchange for his cooperation. She did not ask for money. She asked for information regarding the internal affairs of the Paris family. Julian, paralyzed by the threat of exposure, agreed to meet her the following night. The dynamic was different here. Julian was not a target to be seduced, but a tool to be sharpened. During their clandestine meeting in a deserted boat shed along the docks, Julian provided Celia with the keys to his father's empire. He revealed that Judge Paris was not the pillar of financial stability he pretended to be. The rice harvests had been failing for 3 seasons, and the judge had been borrowing heavily from illegal sources to maintain the appearance of solvency. Julian spoke of a hidden ledger that detailed these transactions, as well as records of the judge's dealings with the Gentry shipping lines, which could be construed as conflicts of interest. Celia listened, realizing that the Paris family was built on a foundation of rot, every bit as precarious as the Vance and Gentry households. The web of influence had now expanded to encompass 3 of the 4 pillars of the district's power structure. The Vance and Gentry feud was a consuming fire in the open, while the Paris family unknowingly harbored a traitor in their midst. Celia used Julian's information to triangulate the debts and allegiances of the 3 families, seeing the invisible threads that bound them together. She learned that Judge Paris had been quietly arbitrating the disputes between Vance and Gentry, positioning himself as a neutral party while secretly profiting from their conflict. This hypocrisy would be the lever used to topple him when the time was right. By February of 1840, the stress of maintaining his double life began to fracture Arthur Vance's sanity. He was drinking heavily, often starting before noon, and his hands shook uncontrollably when he tried to write. Eleanor Vance, alarmed by her husband's deterioration, attributed it to the stress of the public feud with Gentry, unaware that the root cause was the psychological cage Celia had constructed around him. She increased her social engagements, attempting to project an image of normalcy, but the cracks were showing. The household staff moved through the mansion on tiptoe, fearful of the master's sudden violent mood swings. The breaking point for the region arrived on a rain-slicked night in late February, when Silas Gentry was found stumbling along the river road, beaten and delirious. He claimed to have been set upon by unknown assailants, but the gossip in Darien immediately pointed to agents of Senator Vance. The violence had escalated from reputation destruction to physical assault, crossing a line that the planter class could not ignore. Sheriff Halloway, out of his depth and overwhelmed by the complexity of the animosities, could barely maintain order. The district was a powder keg, and the fuse was already burning. Celia watched the chaos unfold with the detachment of a chess master seeing the endgame approach. The feud between Vance and Gentry had reached a fever pitch. The Paris family was compromised from within, and the social fabric of the river basin was tearing at the seams. She had engineered this entropy, turning the strengths of these men, their pride, their secrets, their appetites, into the very instruments of their destruction. The first phase of the operation, the gathering of leverage and the sowing of discord, was complete. It was time for the second phase, the phase of blood and water, to begin. The first stroke of the final design fell on a mist-shrouded morning in March of 1840, when a crab fisherman navigating the tidal creeks near Doughboy Sound made a gruesome discovery. Entangled in the roots of a massive cypress tree was the body of Silas Gentry, bobbing face down in the brackish water. The authorities were summoned, and Sheriff Halloway arrived to find a scene that defied the usual narratives of river accidents or drunken misfortune. Gentry's ankles had been bound with heavy iron stove bolts, a deliberate weighting that ensured the body would remain submerged, only surfacing due to the shifting tides of the equinox. The discovery sent a shockwave through the community, for it confirmed that the violence that had plagued the district was neither random nor spontaneous. When the corpse was hauled onto the muddy bank, the true horror of the act was revealed. Gentry's back had been flayed, and carved deep into the raw flesh was a single word: absolution. This was not merely murder. It was a theological statement, a brutal sacrament performed upon a sinner. Sheriff Halloway, a man accustomed to the blunt trauma of bar fights and the calculated cruelty of overseers, found himself staring at a level of premeditation that chilled his blood. The torture was evident in the burns on the man's chest and the methodical breaking of his fingers, suggesting a period of captivity and suffering before death. The genteel facade of the planter class had been ripped away to reveal a visceral Old Testament judgment. The investigation into Gentry's final days revealed a man spiraling into paranoia. Witnesses in Darien reported that he had been drinking heavily in the days leading up to his disappearance, raging about betrayal and unseen enemies. He had last been seen leaving a tavern near the waterfront on a Tuesday evening, stumbling toward the docks with the intent, he claimed, of confronting a snake in his own house. No one could have known that the snake he referred to was not a rival planter or a business associate, but a woman who had been guiding his steps for months. The timeline of his death coincided with a trip Celia had taken to the coast, ostensibly to purchase specialized linens for Eleanor Vance. Sheriff Halloway attempted to trace Gentry's movements, interviewing dock workers and fellow merchants, but the trail was cold. He inevitably turned his attention to the feud with Senator Vance, the most obvious motive for foul play. Arthur Vance, however, was in no state to orchestrate a complex assassination. When the sheriff interviewed him at Briarwood, he found a man hollowed out by a substance and dread, a shadow of the politician who had once commanded the room. Vance stammered denials, his eyes darting nervously around the room, landing briefly on Celia as she stood silent in the corner. To Halloway, it looked like the guilt of a man who had wished his enemy dead, but lacked the fortitude to do the deed himself. The funeral of Silas Gentry was a massive affair, drawing the curious and the powerful from 3 counties, all gathered to witness the fall of a titan. Martha Gentry, now a widow, played her role with appropriate dramatics, weeping into a black handkerchief while calculating the impact of her husband's debts on her future. Senator Vance attended, looking gray and ill, delivering a eulogy that rang hollow to anyone aware of the vicious words exchanged just weeks prior. He praised Gentry's spirit while privately thanking God that the rivalry was over. He did not know that the instrument of his own demise was standing just a few feet away, arranging the flowers with a calm, terrifying precision. In the shadow of this public mourning, Celia returned to Briarwood to execute the next phase of her plan. She found Arthur Vance in his study, not drinking, but staring blankly at a ledger he could no longer comprehend. The death of his rival had not brought him relief. Instead, it had brought a terrifying clarity to his own vulnerability. Celia entered the room and closed the door, locking them in together. She did not offer condolences. Instead, she began to speak in a low, steady voice about the nature of accidents and the convenience of silence. She revealed that she had been in Darien the night Gentry died, a fact that could link the Vance family to the murder if disclosed. The senator's panic was instantaneous and visceral. He seized her by the arms, demanding to know if she had killed him, terrified of the answer. Celia did not confirm or deny. She simply stated that she had been seen in places that would raise questions, and that her presence there was tied to his letters. She pulled a bundle of folded papers from her apron, the love letters and bitter rants Vance had written but never sent, letters that detailed his hatred for Gentry and his obsession with her. These documents, if found by the sheriff, would provide a perfect motive for a murder-for-hire conspiracy. Vance realized he was trapped. His own words were the noose around his neck. The blackmail was explicit and devastating. Celia laid out the new terms of their existence. She was no longer a servant to be ordered about, but a partner whose silence had to be purchased. Vance was to use his influence to deflect the investigation, to steer Halloway away from any connection to the household. In exchange, she would keep the letters hidden and her presence in Darien a secret. The power dynamic, which had shifted during the affair, was now cemented. Arthur Vance was a slave to his own creation, a prisoner of the woman he thought he owned. By April of 1840, the senator was a broken man. He stalked the halls of Briarwood like a ghost, flinching at the sound of carriage wheels, terrified that the sheriff had returned with a warrant. He obeyed Celia's instructions without question, fabricating alibis and destroying records that might implicate him in the Gentry feud. He was drinking more heavily than ever, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely sign his name. Eleanor Vance watched her husband's disintegration with a cold fury, unaware of the blackmail, but acutely aware that the house servant seemed to hold a strange authority over the master of the house. The psychological torture Celia inflicted was precise. She would withdraw her affection, refusing to meet him in their usual trysting spots, only to return when he was at the brink of collapse, offering a moment of comfort that reinforced his addiction. She extracted every secret he held, learning about the hidden accounts, the bribed officials, and the true extent of the Vance financial decline. She was preparing the final dose of poison, the one that would not kill the body, but would utterly destroy the man's legacy. The trap was set, and all that was required was a final, sharp blow to bring the structure down. The unraveling of Arthur Vance reached its nadir in May of 1840, when his public demeanor could no longer be disguised as the eccentricity of a politician. He began to ramble during speeches at the State House in Milledgeville, losing his train of thought mid-sentence and staring blankly at colleagues who whispered about his nervous condition. The mighty oak of the Vance dynasty was rotting from the inside, hollowed out by the parasite of his own guilt and Celia's manipulation. He returned to Briarwood in disgrace, retreating to his study for days at a time, emerging only to drink or to seek out the woman who held his life in her hands. The household staff moved through the corridors like ghosts, terrified by the master's weeping that echoed through the halls at night. Eleanor Vance, a woman whose pragmatism was forged in the fires of social climbing, finally confronted the reality that her husband was destroying the family name. She cornered him in the library on a humid afternoon, demanding to know the source of his disintegration. Broken and desperate for absolution from some authority figure, Arthur confessed to the affair. He wept as he admitted his infidelity with Celia, framing it as a seduction he was powerless to resist, a narrative that shifted the blame onto the woman's wiles rather than his own appetite. He did not mention the blackmail regarding the murder of Silas Gentry, believing that confession of the sin was enough to cleanse his soul, unaware that he had just handed his wife the weapon she needed to destroy the evidence of his weakness. Eleanor's reaction was not one of hysterics, but a terrifying, glacial calm. She did not scream or threaten divorce. She simply calculated the logistics of damage control. She realized that a public scandal involving a slave would ruin her children's prospects just as effectively as bankruptcy or insanity. She needed to excise the tumor, and she needed to do it quietly. She left her husband sobbing on the floor of the library and marched to the kitchen, where she found Celia overseeing the preparation of the evening meal. The look in Eleanor's eyes was one of pure, focused enmity, but Celia met her gaze with a serenity that seemed to acknowledge a long-awaited appointment. The transaction that followed was swift and devoid of sentiment. Eleanor arranged for Celia to be sold immediately to a trader named Silas Pinder, a man known for moving troublesome property to the cotton plantations of the Deep South, far from the influence of the coast. There would be no auction, no public notice. Celia would simply vanish in the middle of the night. Eleanor believed she was reclaiming her power, erasing the mistake her husband had made. She did not know that Celia had anticipated this exact scenario months ago, accounting for the wife's inevitable ruthlessness in her grand design. The sale price was set at $900, a profit on the initial investment, which Eleanor viewed as the final restitution for the insult she had endured. Celia was taken from Briarwood on June 2nd, 1840, chained in the back of a wagon with 6 other souls bound for the Alabama markets. She did not look back at the mansion that had been her stage for 2 years, nor did she acknowledge Arthur Vance, who watched from behind the curtains of his study, his heart shattering into pieces. He was losing his addiction and his executioner in a single stroke, left alone with his terror and the letters she still held. Eleanor stood on the porch, rigid as a statue, watching the wagon disappear down the oak-lined drive, convinced she had saved the Vance legacy from ruin. The silence that fell over Briarwood in the wake of Celia's departure was not one of peace, but of a tomb. Arthur Vance descended into a spiral of substance-fueled despair that no political ally could pull him from. He was terrified that without Celia's presence to manage the blackmail, the secret she held would leak. He wrote frantic, incoherent letters to her presumed destination, letters that were intercepted by Eleanor and burned in the fireplace. He was a man haunted by a phantom, realizing too late that the cage he had entered had no exit, even with the jailer gone. The isolation was absolute, pressing down on him with the weight of the humid Georgia air. 12 days later, the final act of the tragedy at Briarwood commenced. On the morning of June 14th, the house servants were awakened not by the breakfast bell, but by a scream that tore through the silence. Eleanor Vance had entered her husband's study to find him slumped over his desk, his wrists opened and bleeding into the inkwell. A straight razor lay on the floor beside his lifeless hand. Beside the body was a note, written in a hand that shook so violently it was barely legible, confessing to the affair and begging God for mercy. It was a self-inflicted end that read like a guilty verdict, a final capitulation to the pressure that had been building since the previous autumn. Sheriff Halloway arrived to find a household in chaos, the mistress rigid with shock, and the servants huddled in fearful whispers. The farewell note was damning, confirming the rumors of an illicit relationship that had driven the senator to madness. But as Halloway examined the scene, inconsistencies began to itch at the back of his mind. The razor was on the wrong side of the desk for a right-handed man, and the angles of the cuts seemed jagged, almost theatrical. Furthermore, the specific language of the note, while in Vance's handwriting, seemed oddly constructed, as if dictated by someone else. He began to suspect that Arthur Vance had not died by his own hand, but had been pushed into the abyss by a force he could not identify. The investigation quickly unearthed the connection that Arthur Vance had tried so hard to hide. Halloway found the hidden compartment in the desk where the senator had kept his private papers, though the most damning letters, the ones Celia had used for blackmail, were gone. However, financial records remained, showing a pattern of erratic behavior and payments that hinted at the leverage Celia possessed. The sheriff also learned of Celia's trip to Darien during the week of Silas Gentry's murder, a coincidence that was too convenient to ignore. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had ensnared the most powerful man in the county, manipulated him into a feud, and then watched him die. Halloway issued warrants for the arrest of Celia, naming her a material witness and a suspect in a conspiracy that spanned murder, blackmail, and self-destruction. He sent riders to intercept Silas Pinder's wagon in Alabama, determined to bring her back to Darien for questioning. He believed he was closing the net on a cunning criminal, a woman who had used her position to topple a pillar of the community. What he did not realize was that the target had already escaped the bounds of his jurisdiction, and the slave he was hunting was operating with a freedom and agency that the laws of Georgia could not comprehend. The chase was on, but the prey was already steps ahead of the hunter. When Sheriff Halloway's deputies finally intercepted the wagon train, led by trader Silas Pinder in the rough country near the Chattahoochee River, they discovered a vessel that was strangely empty of its most valuable cargo. Pinder, a man whose reputation was built on the reliable delivery of human property, presented a bewildered face to the lawmen, claiming that the woman known as Celia had vanished 3 nights prior. He spun a tale of a daring escape into the swamps, asserting that she had slipped her restraints and disappeared into the darkness while the camp slept. The deputies, suspicious of the trader's nervous demeanor, searched the wagon but found no trace of the woman who had allegedly brought the Vance family to its knees. She had evaporated into the humid air of the Georgia frontier. The truth of the escape, as later reconstructed through fragmented testimony and the whispered lore of the underground networks, was far more calculated than a flight into the wilderness. Celia had not fled into the dangerous swamps nor had she relied on luck to secure her freedom. Instead, she had engaged in a transaction with Pinder, leveraging the one currency the trader valued above human flesh: information. She had provided him with the routes and schedules of competing traders, intelligence she had gathered during her time listening to the conversations of powerful men at Briarwood. In exchange for this commercial advantage, Pinder had agreed to look the other way, leaving her restraints loose and providing her with a false head start. Sheriff Halloway, upon receiving the news of the escape, felt the investigation slipping through his fingers like sand. He issued a cascade of warrants and descriptions, circulating notices throughout Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. The posters described a mulatto woman of refined speech and dangerous intellect, a warning that was unprecedented in its characterization of a fugitive. Typically, rewards were offered for the return of laborers. Here, the law was hunting a phantom who had demonstrated the ability to dismantle the social order. The sheriff realized that he was no longer chasing a runaway slave, but a figure who had achieved a mythic status, a specter of retribution that haunted the sleep of the planter class. While the authorities scoured the roads and waterways for a fleeing woman, Celia executed a maneuver so bold it defied comprehension. Instead of fleeing north towards free states or deeper into the anonymity of the Western territories, she turned back toward the epicenter of the chaos she had created. Using a forged pass and the guise of a free woman of color seeking work as a seamstress, she returned to the coast. She settled in the bustling port city of Brunswick, a place where the constant churn of sailors, merchants, and travelers provided the perfect camouflage. She was hiding in plain sight, close enough to hear the gossip about her own crimes. Throughout the summer of 1840, Celia lived under the alias Mrs. Leary, a respectable widow who took in mending and attended the services at a small black church. She watched as the fallout from the Vance and Gentry disasters continued to poison the region. The Vance estate was auctioned off in parcels, the once mighty family scattered to relatives in Virginia and South Carolina, their names synonymous with scandal and weakness. The Gentry shipping interests were liquidated, the ships sold to foreign buyers for a fraction of their value. The destruction was total, a validation of the strategy she had honed over years of silent observation. But Celia's work was not finished. Her design required the dismantling of the third pillar of the district's power structure, Judge Josiah Paris. The judge, though aging, still sat on the circuit court, a symbol of the legal apparatus that enforced the institution of slavery. His son, Julian Paris, remained her willing, if terrified, asset. In August, a message passed through the clandestine networks of the enslaved community, reaching Julian at the Oak Haven estate. It was a summons to a meeting in Brunswick, a command he dared not ignore, knowing that the proof of his crimes against nature rested in Celia's hands. Julian arrived at the boarding house where Celia was staying, a broken man racked by the fear that had been cultivated in him for months. He found her sitting in the parlor, dressed in the fine clothes of a free woman, sipping tea with an air of tranquility that mocked his anxiety. She wasted no time on pleasantries. She informed him that his father's time of judgment had come. She needed access to Oak Haven, specifically to the judge's private study, where the true books were kept. In exchange for her continued silence regarding his sexuality, Julian was to provide her with the floor plan, the location of the keys, and the schedule of the night watchman. Julian, trapped between the fear of social ruin and the horror of betraying his father, acquiesced. He provided the detailed information she requested, effectively unlocking the final gate. He confessed that his father had been secretly borrowing against the estate to cover gambling debts incurred in private games in Savannah, debts that would ruin the judge's reputation for probity. Celia absorbed this new intelligence, adding it to the portrait of corruption she was painting. She now possessed the keys to the judge's professional reputation and the combination to his financial secrets. The infiltration of Oakhaven occurred on a moonless night in September, executed with a precision that would have impressed a military strategist. Using the keys provided by Julian, Celia slipped into the mansion through a side entrance, moving through the darkened hallways with the silence of smoke. She bypassed the sleeping rooms of the family and went directly to the judge's study. She knew exactly which drawer to force, which lock to pick. Inside, she found not only the ledgers detailing the illicit debts, but also a personal diary, a book bound in morbid black leather, in which Judge Paris had recorded his darkest thoughts and abuses. The diary was a revelation. It contained detailed accounts of the judge's corruption, including the selling of verdicts in the circuit court and the extrajudicial punishments he had authorized against enslaved people who had insulted his sense of order. It was a blueprint of the judge's own damnation. Celia took the diary and the ledgers, replacing the heavy book with a decoy to delay discovery. She left the estate as silently as she had entered, carrying with her the ammunition needed to bring the third family to its knees. By October, the slow poison began to take effect. Celia did not act with the immediacy of a street fighter. She acted as a disease, spreading the infection through the body politic. She began to leak select pages from the diary and the ledgers. Extracts detailing the gambling debts were sent to the judge's creditors in Savannah. Pages describing the sale of judicial favors were anonymously delivered to the governor's office. Most devastatingly, accounts of the judge's brutal and illegal punishments were circulated among the enslaved communities and eventually found their way to the abolitionist press in the North. The walls of Oakhaven began to tremble as the judge's empire of secrets started to crumble. The exposure of Judge Paris unfolded with the inevitability of a collapsing dam. By November of 1840, the contents of his diary had circulated through the very channels he had once controlled, poisoning his reputation beyond remedy. Creditors demanded immediate payment on loans that had been secret for years, while political allies, horrified by the detailed accounts of judicial bribery, publicly severed ties with the Oakhaven family. The judge found himself besieged by lawsuits and the cold shoulders of men who had once courted his favor, his authority evaporating in the harsh light of the scandal he could not suppress. The final blow to the Paris legacy fell on a crisp morning in December. Julian Paris, returning from a futile attempt to negotiate with the family's bankers, discovered his father's body hanging from a beam in the estate's barn. The sight was grotesque, the judge's face contorted in a grimace of ultimate defeat. A farewell note, pinned to the lapel of his coat, railed against unseen enemies and denied the charges with a defensiveness that only served to confirm them. Sheriff Holloway, arriving to cut the body down, noted the specific knot used in the rope, a hangman's noose that the judge, a man of letters rather than rope, would have struggled to tie. The death was ruled a self-inflicted act by a coroner, eager to close the file on the district's troubles, but Holloway harbored a deep private conviction that the hand of the phantom killer was at work once more. With the destruction of the Vance, Gentry, and Paris families complete, only one name remained on the list: Elias Thorne. Thorne was a different caliber of target, a man whose reputation was built on a cosmopolitan charm that masked a history of darkness. He was a planter of 40 years, educated in the salons of Europe, and known for his progressive views on agriculture and architecture. However, the intelligence Celia had secured from the underground networks revealed that Thorne carried a shadow from his past. During his time in Paris, he had been involved in a scandal involving the death of a young woman, a crime he had escaped only through bribery and a hasty retreat to American shores. Celia's approach to Elias Thorne was not one of infiltration through the servant's entrance, but a frontal assault on his vanity. In January of 1841, she presented herself at the Thorne estate, posing as a free woman of color, seeking employment as a housekeeper. She used the alias Mrs. Leary and carried forged references that spoke to her immense capability. Thorne, recently widowed and struggling to manage his household without a hostess, was captivated not just by her beauty, but by her intelligence and poise. He hired her on the spot, unaware that he was welcoming the instrument of his reckoning into his home. For the first 2 weeks of February, Celia played the role of the perfect employee with chilling precision. She righted the disorganized accounts, smoothed the friction among the servants, and managed the estate's social calendar with an efficiency that impressed Thorne deeply. He began to seek her company, engaging her in conversations about art and philosophy, believing he had found a kindred spirit. He saw her as an exotic accessory to his cultured life, a testament to his own broad-mindedness. He did not suspect that her calm demeanor was the stillness of a predator, measuring the distance for the strike. The confrontation occurred on February 20th, in the quiet of Thorne's study. He had summoned her to discuss plans for a dinner party, but Celia had a different agenda. She closed the doors behind her and dropped the veneer of subservience. She looked Thorne in the eye and spoke a name he had not heard in years: Genevieve. It was the name of the woman who had died in Paris. Thorne's face went pale, the blood draining away as the comfortable world he had constructed for himself began to dissolve. He stammered a denial, but Celia continued, detailing the circumstances of the woman's death and the abortion that had gone wrong, facts that only the perpetrator or a ghost would know. Thorne, realizing his carefully guarded past was no longer secret, attempted to assert his authority, threatening to call the constable and have her arrested as a runaway. Celia cut him off with a cold smile. She revealed that she had already prepared her insurance, a detailed deposition regarding the Paris incident, written in her own hand, and instructions for its delivery to the French authorities and the Georgia newspapers should she disappear. She was no longer his employee. She was his judge. She demanded that he write a full confession of his crimes, a document that would strip him of his remaining dignity. Over the next 3 days, a macabre ritual played out in the study. Thorne, broken and terrified, wrote the confession Celia demanded. As he wrote, she lectured him on the nature of power and privilege, explaining how his ability to buy his way out of murder in Paris was symptomatic of a system that allowed men to treat human beings as disposable. She was not just seeking to kill him. She was forcing him to acknowledge the moral rot that sustained his life. The psychological torture was far worse than the physical pain she had inflicted on Gentry. She was dismantling his soul piece by piece. On the morning of February 24th, the tension in the study reached its breaking point. Thorne, driven to the edge of madness by the forced confessional, lunged at Celia with a letter opener he had concealed beneath a stack of papers. He charged at her with the desperation of a cornered animal. But Celia had anticipated this violent spasm of resistance. She had positioned herself near a loose rug in the center of the room. As Thorne barreled toward her, she stepped aside, and his foot caught the edge of the carpet, sending him sprawling forward. The fall was catastrophic. Thorne landed heavily on the floor, the letter opener driving deep into his chest, under the weight of his own body. He gasped, clutching at the wound, his eyes wide with shock and hatred. Celia stood over him, watching dispassionately as the life drained from his eyes. She did not move to help him, nor did she gloat. She simply waited until his breathing stopped. Then, with professional detachment, she arranged the scene. She placed the signed confession on the desk, wiped the handle of the letter opener to remove any prints that might suggest struggle, and positioned the body to look like a self-inflicted tragedy born of guilt. Celia walked out of the Thorne estate at mid-morning, carrying a small bag of belongings, passing the gardeners who tipped their hats to the efficient housekeeper. She was 3 miles away, traveling by a rented carriage toward Brunswick before the body was discovered. The death of Elias Thorne was the final note in her symphony of destruction. The 4 families, the Vance, the Gentry, the Paris, and the Thorne, were now ruins, their patriarchs dead by their own hands or by the justice she had delivered. The absolution, carved into Gentry's back, had been the prologue. Thorne's death was the epilogue. Celia had completed the circuit of violence she had designed, leaving the district of Altamaha a graveyard of dynasties. The death of Elias Thorne drew the final curtain on the bloody spectacle that had gripped the Altamaha district for nearly 3 years. Sheriff Halloway, weary and aged beyond his years, stood in the study where Thorne's body had been found, his gaze lingering on the confession that detailed crimes committed an ocean away. While the knew better, he recognized the signature knew better. He recognized the signature elements of the phantom he had been chasing, the perfect positioning of the body, the missing defense wounds, and the uncanny timing that aligned with the presence of the mysterious housekeeper who had vanished into the ether. The sheriff issued his final warrants, but he knew it was a futile gesture. The predator had already left the field of battle. Celia's disappearance following the Thorne incident was not a flight of panic, but a calculated withdrawal into legend. She had accomplished the impossible, dismantling the 4 pillars of the region's power structure with a precision that defied belief. In the months that followed, the legal system struggled to categorize her crimes. The confessions she had extracted, the secrets she had leaked, and the deaths she had orchestrated did not fit neatly into the statutes of the time. The courts were designed to punish the theft of property or acts of open rebellion, not the sophisticated psychological warfare waged by a woman who had turned the master's own vices against them. The public airing of the family's secrets continued long after Celia had vanished. The documents she had stolen from Judge Paris and the confession from Elias Thorne found their way into the hands of abolitionist printers in the North. Pamphlets titled "The Fall of the Georgia Princes" circulated in Philadelphia and Boston, detailing the corruption, the sexual predation, and the moral rot that Celia had exposed. Her actions were reframed not as the acts of a murderer, but as the strikes of a freedom fighter. To the abolitionists, she was a hero. To the planters, she was a nightmare made flesh. And to the legal authorities, she remained an unsolved cipher. In September of 1841, Celia made her final move to ensure her story would not be lost to the selective memory of history. She contacted a journalist named Silas Finch, a man known for his radical views and his willingness to print stories that the mainstream press suppressed. Through an intermediary, she arranged a meeting in a boarding house in Brunswick. She arrived heavily veiled, her identity concealed, but her voice steady and clear. She spent 4 hours answering Finch's questions, providing details of the seductions, the blackmail, and the murders that only the perpetrator could know. The interview was a revelation, a transcript of vengeance that laid bare the architecture of the planter class's vulnerability. Celia explained her methodology, describing how she had used the prison of appetite to trap men who believed themselves masters of the universe. She spoke of the loneliness of Arthur Vance, the vanity of Silas Gentry, the hypocrisy of Judge Paris, and the hidden crimes of Elias Thorne. She articulated a philosophy of resistance that was terrifying in its clarity, that the system of slavery contained the seeds of its own destruction, and that those who were enslaved were the gardeners of that ruin. When Finch asked why she had risked capture to tell her story, her answer was recorded with exacting precision. She stated that she wanted the historical record to show that an enslaved woman possessed the intellect to outmaneuver the ruling elite. She wanted to shatter the lie of inferiority that underpinned the entire social order. She was not seeking forgiveness, nor was she begging for understanding. She was demanding recognition of her agency. She finished the interview by warning that as long as men claimed ownership over other human beings, they would live in fear of the very people they oppressed. The publication of Finch's articles in the Georgia Freedman's Chronicle caused an uproar that rippled through the South. The series, titled The Confessions of the Altamaha Phantom, was banned in several states, but copies circulated underground, passed hand to hand in the dead of night. The narrative forced a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that the genteel society of the planters was a brittle facade. The white establishment raged against the veracity of the account, denouncing it as fiction, while the enslaved communities embraced it as a gospel of empowerment, a secret history written in blood. Sheriff Holloway read the articles with a sense of grim finality. The details matched his investigation perfectly, confirming suspicions he had held for years, but could never prove in a court of law. The hunt for Celia intensified in the press, with substantial rewards posted by the state legislature and private citizens. Yet, despite the manhunts and the dragnets, she was never apprehended. She had dissolved back into the population from which she had emerged, a ghost who had walked among the lions and devoured them one by one. The fate of Celia remains one of the great enigmas of the antebellum era. Some historians point to a record of a woman of color who taught at a school for freedmen in Philadelphia in the late 1840s, a woman whose demeanor and education matched Celia's profile. Others cite a passenger manifest from 1847 listing a Mrs. Leary traveling to Liberia, suggesting she sought to build a new life in the land of her ancestors. A third theory, supported by a letter found in a Savannah attic in 1912, suggests she lived out her days in anonymity in the very district she had terrorized, working as a seamstress and watching the ruins of the families she destroyed. The legacy she left behind was a stain on the conscience of the South that no amount of whitewashing could erase. The four estates, Briarwood, Driftwood, Oakhaven, and the Thorne property, never recovered their former glory. The heirs of the Vance and Gentry lines were scattered, their fortunes dissipated by scandal and debt. The district itself became a cautionary tale, a place where the masters walked with a little less certainty and the servants moved with a little more pride, knowing that the power dynamic was not as absolute as the laws claimed. The fear that Celia had instilled lingered in the air like the smell of the salt marshes. Celia's story stands as a testament to the corrosive nature of oppression. She was a villain to some, a hero to others, and a victim of a system that denied her humanity. Her campaign of terror was a mirror held up to the brutality of the slave society, reflecting the violence back upon the perpetrators with compound interest. She proved that intelligence knows no color, and that the human will cannot be broken by chains or statutes. In the end, she was not a ghost or a demon, but a woman who refused to be invisible, forcing a nation to look at the horrors it had wrought